So for starters, I just want to introduce myself, just because I see some possible new faces out there. My name is Corey McKinney. I am a conservationist for the ISA research group down here at the Iowa Soybean Association. Over the last about year and a half now, we've been working on the Skillet Creek Watershed Plan, and that's kind of what I want to touch on today. Kind of go through the process of how we built the plan, the producer and stakeholder involvement, as well as just some basic characteristics about the watershed, some stuff that we've uncovered, not necessarily uncovered, but documented, and I have a few maps that I'd like to show as well. So we will dive right in. I appreciate all you guys logging on here in the morning to watch this. I know it is becoming a busy time of year, so I'll make it short and sweet. And please feel free to reach out with any questions. I will have my contact information at the end, or if you'd like, please send a chat through this webinar as I'm going through. So for starters, like I said, it's the Skillet Creek Watershed, kind of focused around Dayton there. We're just shy of 21,000 acres. So this is classified as a Huck 12 in watershed terms. It's kind of some of those smaller scale watersheds. But this is a general map of it. We show some of the main stem of the Skillet, as well as some of the tributaries breaking off, coming through Dayton and heading to the western part of the watershed. To look at a big scale of where exactly Skillet fits into the rest of the watershed network in the state, the little orange dot there in the middle is Skillet, and then just around that is kind of that lighter blue shade, which would be the middle Des Moines, and then both of those are inside the Des Moines River, which goes all the way down there in southeast Iowa, Lee County, stretches all the way through central Iowa and up into even Minnesota a little bit. So that's kind of how the little watershed we're talking about today fits into the bigger scale watersheds and kind of the basic demographics of where we're working with. So I wanted to talk briefly about watershed planning, how ISA does it, and kind of the process of what we went through to date and where we are and where we're going to go in the future. So initially we had that watershed characterization. That's kind of what I'm going to touch on here in the next few slides. We've worked with producers, landowners, as well as other organizations that have imagery or any sort of data that we can kind of compile to get the best description of the watershed, to kind of put all those puzzle pieces together to see what we're working with. So that's kind of that first first step in the planning game. Secondly, and probably the most important, is the stakeholder involvement, right? So the watershed plan is built for producers and landowners and whoever has a chip in the game in that watershed to move towards our soil and water conservation goals. So having the stakeholder, the producer, the landowner, whoever that may be involved is extremely crucial. Number one, because they're the ones that are going to carry this out, as well as they're the ones that understand what works best in their watershed or in their operation. Is there certain practices or techniques that don't seem to work as well in this area? No one can tell us better than the actual people that live there. So that's kind of that stakeholder involvement. And I'll touch into how we got those producers involved later on in the presentation here. But we did hold 3 meetings throughout the process that we got everyone in one room and kind of talked about conservation and goals for the watershed and planning and so on. And I'll dig into that as we move. So, I just mentioned goals, but that's kind of the next step down. So we have those stakeholders, determine some goals. Where do they want this watershed to be in the future for their soil and water conservation needs? As well as, goal development is what's on the slide there, but it's also great to reflect on what goals have we already accomplished and where we at currently with conservation, because we have to know where we are to be able to figure out where we want to go. Approaches for meeting those goals. I like to refer to this as kind of that conservation toolbox, right? So we need a lot of tools for a lot of different jobs. And when we can determine what those jobs are or those goals, we can kind of build that toolbox and figure out what tools do we need to accomplish those goals and what tools will work best for certain situations, certain operations, or any sort of unique situation that a landowner may have. And then, then we kind of move down to that acquiring resources for implementation, or implement the program. So resources can be in the form of technical assistance, or most commonly it can be in the form of funding, right? so we can bring in other project partners to this watershed, hopefully down the road, to help some of those farmers with that initial cost share when they're kind of getting their feet wet to try in some of these new practices, as well as maybe hiring a coordinator that is that expert that is there on site in the area that can help producers and landowners kind of move towards and get the ball rolling down this conservation path. So to look back slightly, where we are currently is kind of in between that approaches for meeting goals and acquiring resources for implementation. That's kind of where that watershed plan gets finalized. The watershed plan is extremely crucial for accomplishing that acquiring resource aspect, because it's a plan. We can go to project partners or go to potential funders and say, here's what we want to do. This is what it's going to cost, so they can kind of have an idea of what we're talking about. And then obviously once that, whether that's TA or funding gets acquired, then we move to implementation. So actually doing the practices on the ground, adapting no-till, cover crops, edge of field practices, wetlands, whatever it may be. And then after that, we go to that evaluate and monitor. We want to make sure that the practices we're putting in are working right, they have good benefits, as well as the plan that we created, that it is working, we're going down the right path, or, do we need to tweak something, or so on. So that's kind of the overall super brief overrun of the watershed planning process that we do here at Iowa Soybean. And please, like I said, send me a message. Feel free to call me at the end here if you have any questions on how we did this stuff, because I'm kind of scratching the surface here. So I wanted to talk quick about those goals, right? So how we got those stakeholders involved, and how we did that to figure out, what are the concerns in the watershed, and what do we kind of want to tally up to maybe those top 3 or 4 aspects that we really want to tackle in this plan. So what we did at some of the initial meetings is we had the participants, that could be a variety of people, landowners, producers, city, anyone, kind of talk about, what are some concerns they have in the watershed. As you can see here, this is kind of a big sticky note we had hanging up in the room, but water quality came up, nutrient management, tile and water management, erosion, flooding, markets and economics, that's a very big one that sometimes doesn't get mentioned, education and opportunities and practices, data information, all that kind of stuff. So each participant to the meeting, I think it was 3 of these blue dots that you can see stuck next to each one of those categories. And they were able to go up and essentially vote, right? So vote for whichever practice or whichever topic they felt like was the most important and they'd like to put into those goals. So from this, we were able to take some of these some of these categories that had the most votes. Obviously, we have to consolidate a little bit so we can make these big overarching goals. But these are what we came up with here. So the first one was improve water quality. I know that on that last slide, the improve water quality specifically category maybe only had a few votes, but when we go into tile water management and erosion and all those other aspects, they kind of all fall in that water quality bucket. So that's where we kind of consolidated and made that one big overarching goal. Number 2, extremely important is that build that soil health. So building organic matter and other aspects of soil health, it's kind of the foundation of conservation, right? So number 3, the management of creek flooding, flashiness, and erosion. I know I mentioned that erosion aspect and improved water quality, but we kind of made this its own separate goal just because there was an increased focus on stream bank erosion specifically, as well as Skillet Creek has, over the past few years, has become, quite flashy and flooding quite frequently. So trying to figure out ways that we can navigate that. So it's kind of a specific goal, but the interest was there and it was expressed, so we did kind of make that its own. And then lastly, and probably most important, because it's hard to tackle the first 3 if we don't have the 4th, but increase funding and opportunities for producers as well as promote practice awareness. So this would be, bringing other projects on board or partners on board to get that funding there, as well as the conversations were made here of possibly maybe purchasing some sort of equipment that the farmers in that area could use to, kind of start their process to whether that be strip till or no till, as well as using other, farmers and producers in the watershed that are, experts at some of these practices and have been doing it for several years to kind of help others out and get this ball rolling. So moving on here. Oh, sorry, I jumped one too many. I kind of want to just briefly go over some of the characteristics of the watershed. So the first map I have here is essentially just an elevation map, right? So we have some of those the red colors into yellows are some of the higher elevation of the watershed. We get down to those blues, purples, pinks is some of the lower end of the watershed. So down there in the southeast corner, we kind of see where Skillet dumps into the Des Moines River. As you can assume, that's some of the lower areas. We kind of come up those tributaries, up those draws, those cuts into some of the flatlands. We see those colors start to mold back into those yellows and reds. Majority of the watershed, though, is relatively flat when we get to the western side and even the northern side. And this map portrays that pretty well. So then just going down into slope classes, a lot of people are familiar with these. We have them broken down into the categories, the A through Gs. As you can see, you get down there to the confluence where Skillet dumps into Des Moines. We get a lot of those steep slopes, those cuts, those ridges, those gullies. So you see a lot more of those purples and pinks. But as we move up into the watershed, we see some of those flatter slope classes, you know, from that 0 to 2% and 2 to 5. As my title says here, you know, 67% of the watershed has less than 2% slopes. So that's extremely flat, and you know, which is pretty well assumed when we get up into that, you know, that northern central Iowa area. It's great for farming. We have that nice flat terrain, but you can actually see the road ditches are classified in here. You see those red lines. There's a little bit steeper slopes there as we're going into those ditches. So yeah, so whenever we look at soil types and slope, we can kind of put in HEL ground, right? So highly erodible land. You know, luckily for Skillet Creek, the map is pretty bare, which is good to see, right? Other watersheds, we can see majority of it have some of these orange and red numbers throughout it. But those red aspects kind of are areas that are deemed highly erodible, and then some of those orange areas are those potentially highly erodible. These are kind of built looking, like I said, you know, percent slope, soil types, and a variety of things that kind of determines that HEL classification. So lastly, when we put everything together, we can kind of come up with this as soil erosion risk, right? You know, soil erosion risk is mainly kind of an aspect that is implemented on ag ground or non-forested areas, just because it's kind of tough to do some of the modeling and calculations. That's why you see some of those blank spots down there on the eastern side and where the main stream of the Skillet goes into the Des Moines. A lot of timber and other vegetation down there. So we see some of that purple and that blues are some of those high areas. So kind of northwest of town there, we see a pretty good gully coming in there, which is actually the main stream of the Skillet. And then we get into those yellows and those, like I would say, that tan up into the flatlands where we have really low to moderate soil erosion risk. But depending on soils and slopes, we do see some areas there that do have some high, but nothing too alarming. Yeah, I'm jumping ahead. There we go. So, you know, most importantly, right, is productivity. So we have, this map shows the CSR2, so that's the corn suitability rating. As you can see, majority of the watershed has that nice green color up there on all those flatlands. That's kind of representing that higher CSR rating. We have that good crop production. There is some areas of yellow we see in there, so that's that 40 to 60 CSR rating. But overall, as most of you would assume, we do have you know, good productivity throughout the watershed. Obviously, when we get down into those steeper slopes, like I said, where the stream is going down into the Des Moines River, and majority of that ground is all timber and other vegetative types. So we don't see, you know, super high productivity there, but it is good to see. So here's a kind of confusing map, but I like to show it. This just kind of shows, you know, the current land use, I guess you could say. So as you can assume, you know, we just looked at that map that shows the majority of it is productivity, is very productive, very high CSR2 ratings. So we have that corn and soybeans is almost 70% of the watershed, 76%. Grass and pasture comes in at 5%, and then that forested trees comes in at 11%. So all those kind of tan and lighter tan colors represent those corn and soybean areas. We get down into those darker greens kind of represent, you know, a lot of those forests. This map does break it down from coniferous and deciduous, which gets a little specific, but it's good to show. And some of those orange areas kind of show some of those grass and buffers and pasture. But overall, you know, this is a largely dominated corn and soybeans production watershed. And you know, the previous maps as well as this one represents that pretty well. So we did do what we call a road survey. So, we had all the characteristics down through some of our modeling and past data. So we also wanted to figure out, where are we currently at for conservation? So this is an estimate because it's the best that we can do at the time. We drive those watersheds. We try to see those no-till acres, those cover crop acres, and break those down to see where we currently are. I've presented these numbers to that farmer group. They seem to be pretty close, or as close as an best estimate as we could get. So if anyone has any, objections to this, please let me know. I can tweak some of this. But no-till acres came in at about, almost 1,700 acres, 800 acres of cover crops. Some of these ponds, sediment basins, grass waterways, CRP, county conservation, a lot of that stuff is brought from some of the statewide conservation mapping that is done. So that's where a lot of those numbers were pulled from. Obviously, there's probably more than 3 ponds in the watershed, but documented ponds through that modeling is what we had. And then I have a map here that kind of shows that exact table that I was looking at. So those brown fields represent the no-till, and we have the waterway, the ponds, the grass waterways, all kind of represented here. Overall, it's spread out pretty decently throughout the watershed. And it's a good notch towards this conservation goal. We're definitely moving there, but we can also see this as that there's definitely room for improvement, and there's definitely open acres out there that we could try to adapt something on. And that's kind of what I'm going to lead into here next. So when we look at current conservation, as well as we look at our goals, right, where we want to be. So this graph shows orange bars are our goals. And these bars are taken, especially the phosphorus and the nitrate numbers are taken exactly from the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy, with that 29% reduction in phosphorus and that 41% reduction in nitrate. The soil erosion goal, which is this orange bar on the top, that kind of represents that secondary benefit, I should say. So soil erosion isn't necessarily a parameter or a topic that we specifically target, but this is the goal we're going to achieve by tackling these phosphorus and nitrate goals. A lot of practices that, especially phosphorus goals, that tackle this phosphorus reduction also have great soil erosion benefits. Same goes for nitrate. Not as much as the phosphorus aspect, but this is that secondary benefit. So if we accomplish these phosphorus and nitrate goals, this is where we're going to be in soil erosion. And we're looking at, almost 65% reduction overall through the watershed. When we look at these blue bars, that's currently where we are. And these currently where we are calculations were made off of that current conservation map and chart I was just showing you, and using some of those Iowa nutrient reduction numbers as an average percent reduction for those practices, and calculating out roughly where we are. As you can see, that these phosphorus and soil erosion bars are higher than what that nitrate bar is. And that's just because that focus was very emphasized on soil health and soil erosion in the past. So we see, good gains on those phosphorus and soil erosion aspects. The nitrate is kind of the new thing. That's what we're trying to focus on a little bit more and target a little bit more. So that's why that bar is slightly lower there. But like I said, we're off of 0. It's a start, right? So we'll build on that as we go. So make sure we don't have any questions here. Nope. All righty. So before we dig into, how many practices and practices go where, I want to talk about, generally how we came up with what practices we wanted to use. So that's kind of that tools and building that conservation toolbox. So we did this activity that is, it's very interesting to do with producers and landowners throughout the state. And what I do is I throw this arrow on the wall, and it's a likeliness for adoption. And then myself and whoever attends the meeting, like I said, farmers, landowners, we kind of brainstorm conservation practices. So you'll see a lot of duplicates and sticky notes here because, each individual participant came up with their conservation practices, and I had them stick them on the board to figure out, what's more likely to be adopted and what's less likely to be adopted. So there's 2 ways you can look at this, right? So we want to have great impact, great implementation. We want people to be willing to adopt stuff moving forward on a voluntary basis. So we need to figure out what practices are more likely to be adopted, and we can focus on those to implement and make this easier and more consistent and a less lift for the watershed. You can also look at this as maybe a possible education gap. So is there practices that fell on that less likely aspect, but we know through other producers that these practices do work in the watershed and they can work? You know, is there an area where maybe we need to do some field days or outreach to kind of get that education curve flattened so more people are familiar at the benefits of the practice, you know, the low impact to their farming operation to no impact at all, and figure out, you know, what are these primary tools and these tools that we can add in and learn how to use them as we go to add to that conservation toolbox, and move down that road of the soil and water conservation goals. So if we move into, oh, real quick here, I wanted to talk about this conservation pyramid. So this is kind of the framework of, you know, soil and water conservation in general, and where those practices fit in. So obviously at the bottom of the pyramid here, we have infield practices like no-till cover crops and then soil health practices. You know, some of these practices may fall in both categories, but they are the backbone to the conservation, right? But they also take a lot of those practices to have the same impact as some of these practices that fall on the top of the pyramid. So in streams like ponds and wetlands, and edge of field like bioreactors and saturated buffers, there's much more site constraints here, so they can't go everywhere, but whenever they are put in, they have a big impact. But to get some of these practices, those top two tiers, you know, adapted, we need that framework, that base infield and soil health practices. Just the magnitude of those practices are going to be much larger for them to have a similar impact to some of those site constraint practices. So now we've kind of talked about practices, where they fell on that likeliness to be adopted, you know, practices that may need that education gap. We've looked at the conservation pyramid to figure out what are our base practices that we need, and we need a lot of them. So that's going to cover majority of the watershed, and how many of those, you know, site constraint or more specific practices do we need? So as we start at the top of this graph or chart I have here, we're kind of working on that base, those base two soil health and infield practices. We have nutrient management. We have that on 100% of the corn acres, so that's 9,000 acres in the watershed. No-till, we have that on all of the soybean acres plus 40% of the corn acres. Cover crops, again, we have that on all of the soybean acres and 40% of the corn acres. The reason those numbers are similar is because a lot of times no-till and cover crop kind of come hand in hand. And when those operations are happening, you most of the time see both of them. One thing that is not mentioned in here is the possibility of strip till, right? So strip till is definitely a good gateway to get guys kind of transitioned over to that no-till and get their feet wet and realize, you know, there is benefits to this. It can help my operation, and we can move towards that no-till goal. But we're looking at big picture here. We want to get guys to no-till. That strip till aspect is definitely something that, you know, a technical provider, whether that be a watershed coordinator or whoever, can definitely help guys get to that end goal. We have conversion of row crop to CRP. We have 200 acres of that. That kind of comes from some of those areas that were currently being farmed and maybe fell under those high HEL ground stuff, that highly erodible land. There's probably 200 acres we could work in there to convert that to CRP and maybe lower our phosphorus and surface runoff and sediment goals there. So now we start to get into some of these bigger practices, right? We have these wetlands, and in the next slide, I'll show you a map of kind of what this looks like. But we have 3 wetlands identified in the watershed to be put on kind of some of those main streams. We have drainage water management. We have 10 of those, saturated buffers and bioreactor, 26, basin and terraces and stream buffers. We kind of put those as needed. Those were brought up a lot and were a good concern, but we didn't have an exact quantitative number for those. So I think those are somewhat of a site specific area. And we did see a lot of stream buffers currently. So those are kind of an as needed to add them in whenever there's sites that see fit or producers that are willing. So when we look at this map, and one thing I want to note as we move into this is that, you know, I refer to these watershed plans a lot like a roadmap, right? So we know where we are and we know where we want to go. So obviously, if anyone that's taken a road trip, right, knows that there's a lot of different ways to get to point A to point B. And it depends on, you know, do you want to take the scenic route or the fast route? And it can really vary throughout the process. So, you know, essentially the route I have chosen here is not the only route. We have to start somewhere to kind of get a ballpark of what we're looking at. You know, what are our cost estimates? So, you know, just because I have a wetland placed here, a bioreactor placed here, that does not mean that's the only place to put it. And this is just our first stab at it. And we can definitely tweak this as we move down the road and figure out what route is going to work best for the Skillet Creek watershed. What plan is going to work best for the producers and landowners within it. So we look at this map here. Some of those the brown fields are cover crop fields. Kind of that dark green is soil health. That soil health is, if you peel back all these layers, you'd see it on every single ag field in the watershed. So that, soil health is a broad category, and I don't think I need to get into that because a lot of people know what I'm talking about there in aspects. But you see the saturated buffers are some of those purple squiggly lines that fall on some of those mainstream sections. The bioreactors are these red dots. And then the wetlands and the wetland drainage areas. So the light blue areas you see on the map are actually the areas that are going to be drained into the wetlands. And then the wetlands are some of the darker blue areas. And also those are just 3 that were chosen. There's other opportunities. Same goes with bioreactors and saturated buffers. When we model this, the opportunities are all over the watershed. We pick a kind of confined few that kind of match our goals. So there is other options. There's some ponds on there. There's some grassed waterways. There's various other maps. And you can definitely dig in on this. I'll kind of touch in a minute, but all of this watershed plan, as well as the video, is going to be recorded and on our ISA website. So you can definitely go tap in on that. So one important thing to think about is how much is this going to cost, right? So the first number I have here is the annual budget. So before we get into too far into the terms, I want to talk about the time frame for this. So the goal we have set on this is 2035, and that's kind of based off the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy. That's the planning horizon that they have determined, and that's just a goal, right? It's not a deadline. So when we look at this, the annual budget of $441,000 and some change there, $400, that encompasses all of the annual costs. So that would be cost share for cover crops or no-till, as well as a $100,000 budget was incorporated into that for a watershed coordinator and other technical assistance and outreach materials. So maybe that's buying a strip till rig that people can use, or support for that technical assistance provider, whether that be a watershed coordinator or what other aspects. So that's the annual budget. That's what it would cost per year to implement all the cover crops no-till that we have incorporated in here. So the overall practice, because a lot of those practices are more permanent stuff, so there's a one-time cost, there's not a yearly cost for some of these. The annual capital, or not annual, the overall capital for structural practices is that 1.1 million, or it's almost 1.2 there, I guess. But that's all the money that'd be required to do the wetlands, bioreactors, saturated buffers, drainage water management, grassed waterways, and that aspect. So I know these numbers seem very large, and they are, trust me. But I have some bullets here that kind of put this into context. So if we look at gross annual revenue, and how I calculated this was I looked at the average corn and soybean yields as well as average prices in the watershed and calculated that out to figure out that the watershed on average, these are rough calculations. I'm a conservationist, not an accountant, so don't hold me too accountable here, but it definitely helps me myself wrap my head around it, and I've heard it does the same for others. But that gross annual revenue is about 10.9 million. So whenever we, add in the annual budget, which is the 441,000, that's about 4%. So 4% of what is made from the watershed is what it would take to implement what we've suggested here. So, and that's a lot of money, right? That's 4% of the income, and that's not including, I'm just going over in gross annual revenue, not net. So, the costs for operations are not incorporated in there. So this is a great bullet to also show that assistance is going to need to be, we're going to need assistance from other partners to be able to tackle this and get this rolling. So now whenever we try to put the overall capital into context, what I did was figured out the average land rate for the watershed there and then calculated that out on agricultural acres. And the farmland asset value for the whole watershed is $137.3 million. And then when we kind of come back and put that annual capital of the almost 1.2 million into context, that's about 0.84% of the farmland asset value. So once again, when we put it into context, those percentages don't seem too bad. We're also looking way down the road. We're not talking about doing this in a couple of years, but this definitely proves that, you know, we're going to need some assistance in this, and getting cost share or whatever that looks like. You know, there's a lot of opportunities to bring projects and other funders into this stuff, but having numbers like this and creating that plan is definitely a great way to get there. So that is really what I have for a brief overview of the watershed plan. You know, like I mentioned, please send me an email, call me, send some chats right now if you have any questions. But the actual watershed plan itself is going to be on our Iowa soybean website. You can go in there and look at the resources and print materials, and then under watershed plans, there'll be the Skillet Creek Watershed Plan, as well as this webinar will be recorded. So if you talk to a buddy that was curious about it, please steer them towards there, go look at it, have them give me a phone call. And if you disagree with some of the stuff I said here, I'd love to chat with you and kind of try to confine this into something that's going to work, right? We want to make something that is doable and practical, that the producers and landowners in the watershed can implement. So if you got any chats, please send them over. I'll give a minute or two here to see if anyone sends anything over. But once again, I greatly appreciate everyone logging on here. I know it's a crazy busy time of year. So taking your time out of your day is greatly appreciated. And I really appreciate you listening in. I'll give a few more seconds here if anyone's got any questions. And I encourage you too to go look at that watershed plan. It digs into detail and depth way more than I'm just scratching the surface here. There's tons of maps and pictures. It's not all words, I promise you. And it's nice to look at, as well as it kind of digs into that accounting stuff as well. So it's nice to wrap your head around it. All righty, well, I'm not seeing any questions, so and I'm sure there is some, so please reach out to me. As you can tell, I love to talk, and I'm more than willing to chat with you about whatever. So I appreciate it once again, and you guys take her easy and have a safe harvest. Thank you.